Story 1: The Totem in the Forest. The forest has always been a place of escape for me, a sanctuary where the noise of the modern world is silenced by the whisper of leaves and the songs of birds. But not all silences are comforting. Some press down on you, thick and heavy, as though the trees themselves are holding their breath. It was during one of these hikes that I stumbled upon the totem. A grotesque monument in the heart of the wilderness. It stood like a wound in the earth, a totem pole carved with faces too crude to be art and adorned with teeth too human to be coincidence. From the moment I saw it, I knew something was wrong. The air felt heavier, the light dimmer, as though I had stepped into a place that wasn't meant to be found. What I didn't know was how deeply that discovery would haunt me. How it would pull me back to a forest that seemed determined to keep its secrets. This is the story of the totem. Of what it revealed and what it refused to answer. In the summer of 2015, I decided to take a solo hiking trip into a stretch of untouched forest in northern Oregon. I had read about the area in an old guidebook, which described it as one of the few remaining truly wild places. The trails were faint and unmarked. The forest dense and unforgiving, a perfect escape. I had been hiking for 3 days when I found the clearing. The journey up to that point had been uneventful, if challenging. The trails were overgrown. And more than once, I had to retrace my steps after losing my way. But I didn't mind. The isolation was part of the appeal. The clearing appeared suddenly, the trees parting to reveal a circle of sunlight-drenched grass. It was a beautiful sight at first, wildflowers swayed in the breeze. And the golden light gave the space an almost ethereal quality. But as I stepped closer, I saw it. The totem pole stood at the center. A dark and ominous presence that felt entirely out of place. It was roughly 8 feet tall, carved from weathered wood that seemed older than the forest itself. Faces were etched into its surface, crude and uneven, their features exaggerated to the point of distortion. Some appeared to be screaming, their mouths wide and jagged. Others wore expressions of twisted glee, their hollow eyes seeming to follow me as I moved. But it was the teeth that froze me in place. The totem was covered in them. At first, I thought they were animal teeth, long and curved, like a deer's antlers or a wolf's fangs. But as I looked closer, I realized some were unmistakably human, yellowed and cracked. A few still embedded in fragments of jawbone. They protruded from the wood at irregular angles. I felt a wave of nausea as the implications hit me. Who would make something like this? And why? The ground around the totem was just as unsettling. Small piles of stones were arranged in deliberate patterns. And the dirt was marked with symbols I didn't recognize. They looked ancient, almost runic, though I had no way of knowing if they held any meaning. The air in the clearing was stifling, as though the forest itself had drawn closer. The usual sounds of birds and insects were absent, replaced by a silence that felt unnatural. I could hear my own breathing, shallow and quick. As I circled the totem, something about the place felt wrong. It wasn't just the totem or the symbols, it was the sense that I was being watched. I turned sharply, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. But there was nothing. Just shadows and the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. The longer I stayed, the heavier the air seemed to grow. My curiosity warred with my instincts, which were screaming at me to leave. But I couldn't look away from the totem. There was something hypnotic about it. Something that demanded my attention even as it repelled me. My eyes were drawn to one of the faces near the top. It was larger than the others, its features more detailed. The mouth was carved in a wide grin, But the smile was anything but friendly. Its teeth, though carved into the wood, seemed almost real, jagged and uneven. As though the artist had tried to replicate the very teeth embedded in the totem's surface. I felt a sudden urge to touch it, to run my fingers along the rough surface of the wood. But as I reached out, a sound broke the silence, a faint rustling, coming from the trees behind me. I froze, my hand hovering inches from the totem. The rustling grew louder, moving closer, heart pounding. I turned toward the sound, expecting to see an animal or even another person. But there was nothing. The forest was empty. That night, I couldn't sleep. The image of the totem was burned into my mind. The faces and teeth seared into my memory. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them staring back at me. I left the forest the next morning, cutting my trip short. The clearing and its strange monument had shaken me in a way I couldn't fully explain. But even as I returned to the safety of my home, the totem stayed with me. I couldn't stop thinking about it, replaying the discovery over and over in my mind. I searched for answers online, scouring forums and articles about strange occurrences in Oregon's forests. But I found nothing, no mention of a totem. No stories of carvings or teeth. The lack of answers only fueled my obsession. A part of me wanted to forget, to let the memory fade into the background. But another part of me, the part that had always been drawn to the unknown, couldn't let it go. A year later, I made the decision to go back. This time, I came prepared. I brought a camera, a notebook, and a voice recorder, determined to document everything I found. I wanted proof, not just for others, but for myself. The forest felt different this time. The trail, once overgrown and faint, was now easier to follow. The trees seemed less dense, the air lighter. I reached the clearing by mid-afternoon, my heart racing with anticipation. But when I stepped into the clearing, it was empty. The totem was gone. I walked to the center of the clearing, where it had stood, and found only a patch of grass and dirt. There were no drag marks, no signs that something had been removed. It was as if it had never been there at all. I spent hours searching the surrounding area, circling wider and wider in hopes of finding some trace of it. But there was nothing, no stones, no symbols, no teeth. The forest offered no answers. Even now, years later, the totem haunts me. I know what I saw. The faces, the carvings, the teeth, they were real. But the lack of evidence has left me questioning my own sanity. Was it a relic of some forgotten ritual? A warning left by someone, or something, that didn't want to be found? Or was it a figment of my imagination? A manifestation of the forest's eerie stillness? I don't know. And maybe I never will. What I do know is that the forest hasn't felt the same since. Even on familiar trails, I find myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see one of those twisted faces staring back at me. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. But some don't let you go, no matter how much you try to forget. Story 2: The Deadly Glow in Georgia. Winter in rural Georgia is unforgiving. The landscape transforms into an unbroken expanse of white, and the air bites at exposed skin, numbing fingers and toes within minutes. For the villagers of Leah, nestled near the banks of the Inguri River, the cold isn't just an inconvenience, it's a deadly adversary. In December 2001, 3 men from Leah, desperate to keep their families warm, ventured deep into the wilderness to gather firewood. They stumbled upon something strange, two metallic cylinders lying in the snow, faintly glowing and radiating warmth. At first, the discovery seemed like a small miracle in the midst of the bitter cold. But what they thought was a blessing quickly turned into a curse, a nightmare of unimaginable suffering, mysterious illnesses, and a chilling revelation about the dangerous remnants of a fallen empire. What would you do if you found something warm and otherworldly in the middle of a frozen forest? Could you resist the temptation to take it? Or would curiosity and desperation seal your fate? The snow had been relentless that winter. It covered every surface, piling high on rooftops and weighing down the branches of ancient oaks that lined the Inguri River. For the people of Lia, the bitter cold was a constant, gnawing presence. Coal and gas were scarce, their prices skyrocketing beyond what most families could afford. The three men, Georgi, Irakli, and Luca, decided they couldn't wait for relief. They were lifelong friends, bound not just by proximity but by the shared struggles of rural life. When Georgi proposed venturing into the forest to cut firewood, the other two agreed without hesitation. The plan was simple: they would leave before dawn, drive 30 miles east to the forest's edge, and spend the day chopping trees. By nightfall, they would have enough wood to see their families through the worst of the cold. The forest they chose was part of the Kalkiti National Park, a UNESCO World Heritage Site known for its ancient wetlands and towering hornbeam trees. Logging there was strictly forbidden, but the men were willing to take the risk. They were confident they could avoid detection by camping overnight and returning under cover of darkness. The journey to the forest was uneventful, the battered Soviet-era pickup truck bouncing along the uneven roads. By mid-morning, they had reached their destination, a secluded area where the snow lay undisturbed, glittering under the pale winter sun. The men worked tirelessly, their breath steaming in the frigid air as they chopped and hauled logs to the truck. By dusk, they were exhausted but pleased with their progress. The truck bed was piled high with wood, enough to last their families for weeks. As the light began to fade, they decided to gather kindling for a fire. Splitting up to cover more ground, they combed the forest floor, searching for dry branches and twigs beneath the snow. It was Luca who found it first. He had wandered farther than the others, drawn by a strange patch of bare ground in the otherwise snowy landscape. The circle was about a meter wide, its edges perfectly defined as though the snow had been deliberately removed. Steam rose faintly from the exposed earth, curling into the cold air like smoke from a dying fire. Lying at the center of the circle were two metallic cylinders. They were small, about the size of thermoses, and perfectly smooth, their surfaces reflecting the faint bluish glow that emanated from within. Curious, Luca reached down to touch one. The warmth startled him, and he quickly pulled his hand back. Georgi and Irakli arrived moments later, drawn by his shout. "It's warm," Luca said, his voice tinged with awe. The other men took turns picking up the cylinders, marveling at the heat they produced. In the freezing cold, the warmth felt miraculous, like a gift from the forest itself. At first, they speculated about what the objects might be. Georgi suggested they might be batteries, left behind by researchers or surveyors. Irakli wondered if they were part of some military equipment, though he couldn't imagine why anyone would leave them here. Whatever their purpose, the men agreed that the cylinders would be useful. They decided to take one back to camp, leaving the other hidden behind a large rock. Back at their campsite, the men built a makeshift shelter using tarps and branches. They placed the glowing cylinder in the center, letting its warmth radiate outward. At first, it seemed to work perfectly. The heat melted the snow around them, creating a small, comfortable clearing. The men huddled around the cylinder, laughing and toasting with vodka as the night wore on. But as the hours passed, their jovial mood began to sour. Georgie was the first to feel it, a wave of nausea that left him doubled over, clutching his stomach. He dismissed it as the vodka, though he had only taken a few sips. Soon, Luca and Irakli were experiencing the same symptoms. The nausea escalated to vomiting, and by midnight, all three men were pale and shivering despite the heat of the cylinder. They tried to sleep, but their rest was fitful and broken by bouts of retching. When dawn finally arrived, the men decided to abandon their campsite and return to the village. They loaded the truck as quickly as their weakened bodies would allow, leaving behind the rest of the wood they had gathered. By the time they reached Lia, the men's conditions had worsened. Their skin was flushed and blotchy, their eyes bloodshot. Neighbors who greeted them were alarmed by their appearance, but the men waved off their concerns, blaming their sickness on bad vodka and the grueling work in the cold. Over the next few days, the symptoms became impossible to ignore. Large, fluid-filled blisters began to form on their backs and hands, as though their skin had been scalded. The sores grew rapidly, spreading to other parts of their bodies. Georgie, the most severely affected, developed a fever that left him delirious. Luca complained of intense pain in his joints, while Irakli struggled to keep down even small sips of water. Fearing the consequences of admitting to their illegal logging activities, the men delayed seeking medical attention. It wasn't until Georgie collapsed in his home, too weak to stand, that his wife insisted he visit the village doctor. The doctor was baffled by what he saw. The men exhibited symptoms he had only read about in textbooks: severe burns, nausea, and organ damage consistent with radiation exposure. When pressed for answers, the men hesitated. They didn't want to reveal the full truth about the cylinder, but their worsening conditions forced their hand. Georgie, barely coherent, confessed to finding the glowing object in the forest. Alarmed, the doctor contacted regional health authorities, who in turn notified a team of radiation experts. Within days, an investigation was underway. A team of scientists and soldiers, equipped with Geiger counters and protective suits, arrived in Lia and followed the men's directions to the forest. It didn't take long to locate the second cylinder, still hidden behind the rock where the men had left it. The Geiger counters confirmed their worst fears: the cylinders were emitting dangerously high levels of radiation. Further analysis revealed that they were remnants of a Soviet-era radioisotope thermoelectric generator, RTG. RTGs had been used during the Soviet Union's heyday to power remote facilities and equipment, particularly in isolated regions where conventional energy sources were unavailable. These devices relied on strontium-90, a highly radioactive isotope, to generate heat. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, many RTGs were abandoned or improperly disposed of. The cylinders found in the forest were part of this deadly legacy, a ticking time bomb left to decay in the wilderness. The men were transferred to a hospital in Tbilisi, where they were placed under quarantine. Doctors worked tirelessly to treat their symptoms, but the damage had already been done. Georgie, who had leaned closest to the cylinder for warmth, suffered the most severe injuries. The radiation burns on his back spread rapidly, becoming necrotic. His internal organs began to fail, one by one. 4 weeks, He endured agonizing pain as doctors attempted to save him. Multiple surgeries were performed to remove dead tissue. But the damage was too extensive. On May 13, 2004, 93 days after his initial exposure, Georgie succumbed to multi-organ failure. Luca and Irakli, though severely injured, eventually recovered after months of treatment. Their bodies bore the scars of their ordeal, raw reminders of the invisible danger they had encountered in the forest. The tragedy of the three men raised urgent questions about the handling of radioactive materials in the post-Soviet era. How many more RTGs were still out there? Hidden in forests or buried in forgotten locations? How many lives would they claim before they were finally accounted for? For the people of Lya, the story became a cautionary tale, a stark reminder of the unseen dangers lurking in the shadows of history. The forest, once a source of life and sustenance, had become a symbol of death and decay. Even now, as I recount their story, I can't help but wonder how many other relics from the Cold War remain hidden, waiting to be discovered. What would you do if you stumbled upon something strange in the wilderness? Would curiosity lead you closer? Or would instinct keep you away? Story 3, The Stalker from Walmart. It started with a single postcard. I didn't think much of it at the time, a generic flyer for Walmart's auto center, tucked into my mailbox along with the usual stack of bills and grocery store coupons. But what if I told you that this postcard wasn't random? What if I told you it was the beginning of something far more sinister? At first, I chalked it up to coincidence. I had been at Walmart the day before, looking into new tires for my car. My old ones were worn down, and I figured it wouldn't hurt to browse their prices. The postcard felt timely, almost helpful. But then it happened again. And again. Identical postcards, appearing every day like clockwork, always tucked neatly into my mailbox. It didn't take long for me to realize something wasn't right. The auto center employee told me they hadn't mailed anything. And when I finally inspected the postcards closely, I noticed something chilling. None of them were addressed to me. What would you do if you realized someone was deliberately targeting your home? And what happens when the person behind it decides postcards aren't enough? The first week passed in a haze of growing unease. The postcards arrived every day without fail, each one an exact replica of the last. At first, I tried to laugh it off. Maybe Walmart's marketing team is going overboard, I joked to myself, though the words felt hollow even as I said them. Something about it felt too personal. The pristine condition of the cards, the lack of any address, it didn't feel like corporate efficiency. It felt intentional. On the third day, I decided to mention it to my neighbor, Mrs. Kane. She was the kind of person who knew everything about everyone on the street, a self-appointed neighborhood watch, albeit with a more gossipy edge. "Oh, I haven't gotten anything like that," she said, squinting at the flyer I showed her. "Weird, though. Maybe someone's pulling a prank?" "A prank?" I echoed, my stomach tightening. Why would someone do that? She shrugged, a glint of amusement in her eyes. "Who knows? People are strange these days." Her dismissive tone didn't sit well with me, but I thanked her and went back inside. That night, as I sat in my living room scrolling aimlessly through my phone, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. By the end of the first week, I was sleeping with one eye open. I started to notice things, small, subtle changes that would have gone unnoticed if I hadn't already been on edge. One morning, I found muddy footprints on the sidewalk leading up to my mailbox. It had rained the night before, and whoever had left them had been there long after the rain stopped. The prints were large. 2, bigger than mine. And clearly made by heavy boots. The next day, I noticed something even stranger. The bushes near the edge of my driveway were slightly trampled. As if someone had been standing there. Concealed. For an extended period. I stood there for several minutes. Staring at the crushed leaves. Feeling the weight of invisible eyes on me. That night, I decided I needed to catch whoever was doing this. I set my alarm for 5 a.m. and parked myself by the living room window. Phone in hand. Ready to snap a picture or record a video. 4 hours. I saw nothing but the faint glow of streetlights and the occasional car passing in the distance. But just as dawn began to break, I saw him. He was tall. With broad shoulders and a hunched posture. He wore a dark hoodie pulled low over his face, obscuring his features. He moved with a strange, deliberate slowness. As if he knew exactly what he was doing. When he reached my mailbox, he paused. I held my breath as he pulled a familiar-looking postcard from his jacket and slipped it inside. For a brief moment, I thought he would leave. But then, as if sensing my gaze, he turned his head and looked directly at my window. My heart felt like it had stopped. We stared at each other for what felt like an eternity. Though it was probably only a few seconds. Then, to my horror, he started walking toward the house. Panic surged through me. And I ducked out of sight. My mind raced as I tried to figure out what to do. Should I call the police? Confront him? Before I could decide, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps on my front porch. The doorknob rattled. And I realized with a sickening jolt that he was trying to get inside. Go away! I shouted, my voice cracking. There was no response. Only the persistent jiggle of the locked doorknob. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. My fingers trembling so badly I almost dropped it. There's someone trying to break into my house. I whispered to the operator, afraid that he might hear me. As I spoke, I heard a loud crash from the back of the house. Glass shattering. He was inside. I locked myself in the upstairs bathroom, clutching the phone like a lifeline. The operator assured me that officers were on their way. But every second felt like an hour. The house was eerily quiet, save for the faint creak of floorboards. He was moving slowly, methodically, as if savoring the fear he was causing. Then, I heard it, the sound of footsteps climbing the stairs. I pressed myself against the bathroom wall. My heart pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. The footsteps grew louder. Closer. Until they stopped just outside the bathroom door. The doorknob turned. Locked. For a moment, there was silence. Then came the banging. Let me in, he growled. His voice low and menacing. I bit back a sob, trying to stay quiet. The banging grew louder, more violent, until I thought the flimsy door might give way. Just when I thought all hope was lost, I heard the sound of sirens in the distance. The banging stopped abruptly, and I heard him retreating down the stairs. I stayed in the bathroom, trembling, until the police arrived. When they entered the house, they found no sign of him. He had vanished, leaving behind only muddy footprints and the shattered glass of my back door. The postcards stopped after that night. But the fear didn't. Every creak of the house, every shadow on the street, felt like a threat. I installed cameras, upgraded my locks, and tried to convince myself that it was over. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there. Watching. Waiting. Would you ever feel safe again, knowing that someone had targeted you so deliberately? Or would you spend the rest of your life looking over your shoulder, wondering if they might come back? I haven't returned to that forest since. But sometimes, in the dead of night, I dream of it, the clearing, the totem, those grotesque faces, and the eerie silence that swallowed the forest whole. And when I wake, there's a fleeting moment where I swear I can still feel the weight of unseen eyes on me. Did I stumble upon something ancient? Something not meant to be found? Or did something in that forest mark me, decide that I belong to it now? I still wonder if I made a mistake by leaving. Maybe I was supposed to stay. Maybe that's why I still feel its pull, whispering to me in the quiet hours before dawn. What do you think? Was the totem a warning, or an invitation? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoy these eerie encounters, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Wolf Tells, because some stories refuse to stay buried.